through, and we're going to be asking these different experts for their opinions and for the answers. And at the end, we'll make some time for all of you to ask questions and to chat and engage with this panel of experts. So if I could start by introducing the panel of experts, and to the experts, it would be great if you could put on your camera as I'm introducing you so that people can see that you're not just experts, but that you also are really good looking as well as being bloody clever. So first of all, we have Dion Francis, and Dion Francis is from Clyde & Co. Clyde & Co is one of the law firms that we do a lot of work with. So Dion, it's great to have you with us. Dion is a partner at Clyde & Co. He heads up their insurance practice, and he works on a range of their contentious as well as non-contentious matters. He specializes in financial lines, general liability, cover disputes, and so he's a really good expert to be discussing some of the legal aspects of vaccinations, which is the topic for today, Move the Needle. He's represented some of the biggest hospital chains, medical doctors, and attorneys all in this field. So Dion, it's really good to have you with us. Can you hear us? And do you want to say how's it to everyone?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. It's great to be with you. Hi, everyone.
Good stuff, Deon. Nice to have you with us. So thank you very much. Then we have two experts from Swiss Re, and I must say a really big thank you to Swiss Re. So Swiss Re is our lead reinsurer on most of our treaties, and certainly on these lines of business that we're talking about today. We have a fantastic relationship with Swiss Re. So Swiss Re, we'd like to thank you, first of all, for the relationship that we have and the partnership that we have with you, but also for two of your experts for taking up the time to talk to R2 and our brokers. So we have Zaid Bhana from Swiss Re, and Zaid is responsible for treaty casualty business in South Africa. So he's the main guy that we engage with in placing and working through our reinsurance treaties. Your brokers will be good to know that he started out his career as a retail broker, but luckily he was rescued from the dark side, and he then got into underwriting at Commercial Union. So he's also spent time as an underwriter on the coalface with brokers. He's a South African, born and from South Africa, and it's great to see South Africans globally doing so well in a global company and being an expert in his field. And currently Zaid is based in Zurich with Swiss Re, and as I said, he's the lead on casualty treaty business in South Africa. So Zaid, it's really good to have you with us here today.
Thank you, Jonathan and Justin. And I think thank you for the invite. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion on this topic. Let's see.
Perfect. And then also from Swiss Re, we have Ramiro Dip, and he is from Argentina originally, but also works for Swiss Re. And if there's one person that has all of the credentials of an expert, I think it's Ramiro. So he is a senior casualty risk engineer at Swiss Re. He specializes in the life science segment. He's qualified at veterinary school in Argentina. He's got a doctoral degree in toxicology. He's got a PhD in molecular biology. And if that wasn't enough, he's also got an MBA. So Ramiro, no pressure on you to come across as an expert. And I'm sure that we're going to hear great conversations and topics from you today. So good to have you with us, Ramiro.
Thanks for the introduction. It sounds a little bit more than what it really is, but anyway, looking forward to having a great discussion.
Great stuff. And then we have Haley Shell, who may not be on the hot seat, but I would like to say a welcome and thank you to Haley, who's from Swiss Re, and she's our main relationship person at Swiss Re based in South Africa. And Haley, it's been great to work with you, and you just have such a good broad knowledge of so many topics relating to our business. It's great to have you as part of our team today as well. Then we have three different R2 experts, and if there's one thing that R2 wants to be famous for, it's our experts. And today we have Thea Samuels, who heads up R2 MedMal. We have Melita Thurling, who heads up R2 General Liabilities, and we have Jonathan Healy that heads up R2 Financial Lines. So we're going to be hearing different questions from this panel of experts, and without further ado, let's get into it. So before we go into some questions, Ramiro is going to do a brief introduction of the topic.
So, okay, thank you, Justin. So I was really thinking what is the best way. I mean, following on the great session that it was put up last week, which I really enjoyed it. I was really thinking what's the best way to switch towards the more in the insurance side of things, right? So as a risk engineer, I tend to try to break down larger issues into smaller ones. So the way I like to think about the challenges about COVID-19, but more specifically around the vaccines, I see it more as product value chain. So to understand the underlying risks or characteristics of the different steps in this value chain, I think it's a very good approach to try to frame this larger issue. So on one hand side, what we have is the manufacturing of the vaccine. Before you even get to the manufacturing, you have to design it. So there is a process, research and development process prior to that. If all going work, and this has been a very special and spectacular time for research and development in the pharmaceutical industry, but I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So once that phase is let's say in a standard development process, once that phase is completed, then the product gets approval, and only then you really can start scaling up and distributing the product, and finally getting into the patients or the larger population in the case of a vaccine. So the first steps. So on one hand side, the design and the manufacturing, but then you really have a lot of additional steps, being the distribution locally, international distribution, freight, cargo chargers, and then again local distribution within the regions and within the countries, and let's say from larger cities to more rural areas, all of which have their own specific challenges. And then depending on which type of vaccine you're talking about, then you have the final stage, which is once you have the vaccine where you want to have it, is then giving it to the people. So as you can see, from one end to the other end of this value chain, you may have different players, different participants, different insureds, which will have really different exposures, and they will be responsible of these actual little pieces, some of which can be very relevant at one stage and perhaps less relevant on the other end, which all have to come together then to have a successful rollout of a global scale vaccination program as the one we're experiencing nowadays. So that's rather from a general point of view. But in this particular case, when we think about COVID-19, there are really very specific or very particular circumstances, such as the extremely compressed research and development phase. This was really unprecedented. When I first heard about it, I thought this is not going to work. This is not going to be possible. But thanks to the heavy commitment of the different governments worldwide, very significantly the U.S. government, this has been possible within 12 months, within one insurance period, if you want. You have a full development process up to the rollout of the new vaccines. But certainly this comes with some caveats, or with some specific challenges, which in a normal development process, which would have taken anything between 2 to 10 years, would have been properly tackled and addressed during that time. Here, the interest was completely shifted, and then the pressure was completely turned upside down in a way that you really wanted to have a minimally working product out as quickly as possible. So there is a little bit of background noise. If you could please mute, that would be helpful. Um, so that's one of the very specific, characteristics of this situation that we have nowadays. A very compressed, very very tight development process with really very precise clinical trials, which were designed in a way that you can really get a good to go as early as possible, whereas backup information and further information will continue to be incorporated to the to the overall dossier of such vaccines. But then it comes the next challenge. So the next challenge comes around the distribution. So you might have heard that a lot of the vaccines, or at least the two most important ones, which were rolled out December and mid-December, but in particular the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has been approved with a distribution requirement of -80 degrees Celsius. So this is really challenging, and it's different from vaccines and the distribution chain of vaccines that we had until this moment in time, which requires really a lot of stepping up and planning, and particular planning and upscaling of as you may imagine, of facilities and transportation chains. So that was in December, right? Early December was the Pfizer-BioNTech. A couple of weeks later, it was the second one, which was Moderna, which required -20, or at least at the moment in time requires -20. It is foreseen that both the Pfizer and the Moderna, with time, as this data becomes available, that they might be shipped at higher temperatures. So the -80 might become -20, and eventually it could even become 2 to 8 degrees, which is the most common for vaccines. But anyway, cutting a very long story short, the distribution of the vaccines is really the next challenge, and there is a lot of work around that. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, when the vaccines have reached the points where they're going to be administered, we have more storage type of responsibilities or exposures, if you want, storage, handling of those vaccines, and then administering them to the patients. So giving the right vaccine to the right patient in case you may have different vaccines being administered at the same time on the same location. And then also, certainly, any adverse events that may follow, not only linked to the product itself, but also to the administration of the product, more on the med-mal side of things. So you can see, just to finish, it's it's a spectrum, a value chain. So you can really cut it down to the individual, stages of that value chain, the individual players of that chain, and the exposures may vary and change, from one player to the other. And that would be my first approach to breaking down this very complex issue into smaller pieces.
Thank you so much, Ramiro, and I'm sure that all of the brokers are looking forward to getting into the panel discussion and some different questions. Very briefly, Zaid, I think you're going to give us a brief overview of some of the insurance risks, and then we're going to get straight into the different questions to the panel. So thank you, Zaid.
Thank you, and thanks for that, Ramiro. So I think just to set the scene, I will speak purely from a casualty perspective. I'm not going to be touching on any of the other lines of business that don't fall within casualty, and more specifically within the liability frame. That will be more the high-level liability, which then gets broken down to all the specialist lines. So this is indeed challenging and an interesting time also for casualty. We are not really sure how this will play out in the field of losses and or responsibilities, and how claims will be dealt with going forward, because there's a lot of potential for losses to come through or intimated, but also that has to be looked at from a context of the legal perspective. We always speak in casualty, and Deon will be familiar with this, and I too as well, from a legal liability point of view. So I think that for us is key still. I think once the dust settles on the property side, which is ongoing. I think there will be attempts in many cases to try and see on the casualty side with specific lines of business where the potential is that could be claimed for. We already see in other parts of the world where securities class actions have commenced. Some have been turned away. Some have been looked into further, where the court said they will look at it further before throwing it out, or if there's a case here to proceed. So maybe just a few points, Justin, on the lines of business that we really at a high level can see some action. I think the one would obviously be on the product liability, as well as the inefficacy type of scenario, which is two different sets of covers within liability. There's also the issue if one were doing clinical trials, that also is something that that can be affected. Medical malpractice to a certain degree, I mean, Fia will be familiar with this. There could still be a possibility of a claim. And like Ramiro says, it goes across the channel, right, across the whole supply chain. So these type of losses will come up at different points. On the more financial loss side of scenarios, I think there you would look at, which I think Jonathan will touch on as well, the financial, the DNOs, PI types of covers, employers' practices liability as well, various aspects regarding financial performance. And these things are not yet fully known. We are seeing signs now that companies are more so feeling the pressure, and there most probably will be challenges to their balance sheets and statements and so forth. There will always be somebody attempting to try and claim. Whether damages will be paid will be another story, but indeed there will definitely be some form of defense costs or investigation costs. And as with casualty, they tend to be long tail, right? So we see a number of areas within the casualty space that could be affected. Cyber as well. One could also think of cyber in the sense that you're more working from home. Directors can be sued, and indirectly cyber can be part of that as well, where they did not provide the necessary infrastructure for work. There's issues around the ransomware, which is spiked in the last couple of months, and all these issues still have to be dealt with. So I think it's a broad spectrum, and yeah, just as a high level, those are the challenges that we will be facing. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Zaid and Ramiro, for an overview. But we're all here to listen to our experts on the red couch. So I think what our team has prepared, we've prepared a couple of questions that we think are interesting questions. They're going to put up on the screen, and then I'm going to ask our panel of experts to answer them. So Sophia, I think up with you first. Fia is our MedMal expert at I2. What do you know about South Africa's process of registration and individuals being vaccinated at the moment? Can you start with a little easy question to get things going? Thanks, Fia.
Thanks, Justin. Well, first and foremost, from what we do know, and this has been given out by our government, is that any individual who wishes to be vaccinated actually has to register on a platform called EVDS. Our team will be posting the links of these platforms and information in the chat boxes for everyone to have on file. So from a personal point of view, I have a friend that works in the medical sector, and the process is as follows. In essence, you have to register with your ID number, your address, place of work as well, and whether you're on medical aid or not. Just to put a disclaimer, for now, only the Johnson & Johnson's vaccine is basically available, and that's for phase 1 and for the healthcare practitioners in South Africa. So there's a lot of public healthcare involved in this phase for now. Once you've registered, you get a unique code. This unique code will then tell you at which facility you need to be vaccinated, and it does not tell you which vaccine you will be receiving, which is quite interesting because I thought you should be telling individuals upfront what kind of vaccine they will be getting. As well as getting the text message, you will get an electronic vaccine card that says that you have been vaccinated. And if you need to come back for a second vaccine, because some vaccines require 1 dose and others require 2. So for now, this is the process. A lot of us are going to be most probably in the phase 2 of the vaccine based on your age and your comorbidities. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Fia. And great to the panelists. If when you're answering the question, it's great if we see your face on the camera, because you can see how good looking Fia is there and how nicely she's smiling. And again, if you can, the panelists, if you can, keep to the point, and let's move through these questions. We are getting questions on the WhatsApp or the message group, so we will do our best to come back and answer them. So we've got a question from Wendy Ace, and Wendy, that's noted, and we'll do our best to come back and answer it. Sophia, there's been a lot of talk in the news recently about organizations such as Discovery and being part of the vaccination process. I mean, maybe one thing I'll add on your previous comment is that I know a number of healthcare workers that are family and friends of mine that have actually been vaccinated. So the good news is vaccination is actually starting, and it's happening in South Africa. Of course, there's some challenges, but it's actually starting and people are being vaccinated. But Fia, what organizations are going to be part of this vaccination process?
Okay, well, first and foremost, it is a government-run program. So your public health care will be firstly involved in it. So it's quite a few public hospitals as well as clinics within certain areas that's going to be involved in the vaccination process. From a private point of view and private entity level, a lot of us are on Discovery as a medical aid, and I've seen some correspondence coming through that. So your clinics, which might be private facilities, will have access to be a vaccination site. You will have doctors' practices, and it's been some speculation on whether dentists will be involved in the process as well. Retail pharmacies, such as the larger corporate type pharmacies, will be involved in the process. But what was interesting is what I found is that workplaces, such as perhaps our building, might be a vaccination site as well. So it's any type of organization that could register with the Department of Health to be a vaccination site might have this type of exposure as well involved in the process. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fia. So Fia, you're still on the red couch and you're not getting off the hot seat just yet.
Sure.
Sophia, let's talk a little bit about I2, and we're an expert med-mal insurer. What is some of our response in terms of providing peace of mind from a medical malpractice point of view? Can you give our brokers some overview of how we can provide some areas of cover?
Sure. I think that we shouldn't discount that any practitioner, it's its duty to perform the administration of a vaccine. We just want to make sure and very clear that our response is that any individual that has been qualified, and I emphasize the word qualified, to administer the vaccine will enjoy cover under our med-mal policy. It's important to understand that in South Africa, for example, registered nurses are the only individuals that actually pierce the skin, whereas an enrolled nurse would not be able to do such. So it's about the emphasis of qualification. So rest assured, from a med-mal point of view, the administration of the vaccine within the scope of a practitioner will be covered by our policy.
Perfect. Thank you, Fia. We're having a few comments on the chat group that you called Tove. Tove is equally as good looking and equally as smart. But just so there's no confusion, Fia is using Tove's laptop today. So this is Fia, our head of medical malpractice at R2, talking to you. Tove is the other superstar who brings together all of these R2s. So Tove, while we're talking about you, thank you for the role that you've played in bringing R2 to R2 and all of our brokers. Okay, so Fia, then let's talk about what are some of the possible scenarios where complaints may arise due to administration of the vaccine?
It's interesting because I don't know if you guys saw about a week ago when the first vaccine was administered for the president. The interesting scenario was that the nurse that was administering the vaccine didn't actually have gloves on. And I actually asked or sought an opinion on this. It was interesting to say that, for example, it's very difficult to hold a vaccination in your hands with a set of gloves. So it made a lot of memes about this, and I don't know if you guys all saw this, but from a complication point of view, and it has to be said up front that anybody that has ever gone for a vaccine, you get a little bump, it goes red, you get a bit of a fever if you've ever had kids' vaccine administered to them. So you could possibly have scenarios where individuals have the area just a bit red for a few days and they think, oh my God, I'm going to die. which is not always the case. There might be reactions as well to the latex that would be surrounding if someone is administering gloves, or if they're allergic, and this is very rare, allergic to the stainless steel within the injection and the needle itself. Secondly, you could also have where the wrong needle is being used, the length, because it also depends on your weight. So it's not specifically just on the size of the needle only, it's about your weight as well. An allergic reaction could be from different scenarios because you don't really know what's in the vaccine, hence the reason that you need to complete a consent form, and it has to be obviously aware of what you're signing in terms of the vaccine. There are very rare cases where it's something called SIRVA, is SIRVA, and this is where you get shoulder injury caused because of the vaccine. There's 1 in a million type of chance of this happening from what I have seen and my own research. So that is possibly, and there could be necrosis again for the incorrect administration of the vaccine. Having said that, with any type of vaccination taken or drug taken, there's always going to be side effects. We were discussing this internally the other day, and for example, Panado is one of the commonly used over-the-counter type of headache tablet. Yet you're going to have a situation where you could actually get renal failure for taking that vaccine, or well, the tablet itself. So it's just always about managing your own expectations and knowing your rights before you take it and giving consent to that vaccine.
Great, thank you so much, Fia. So we've heard a little bit from Fia, our medical malpractice expert at I2. I think it'll be interesting now to talk a little bit about some of the legal views. So we've got Dion Francis from Clyde & Co, as I said. Dion is certainly a legal expert in this theme. So Dion, here I think is a really interesting question. So internationally, governments have actually been granted immunity from liability because the vaccine is deemed critical. Are you aware of any immunity in South Africa, and what's the stance in South Africa about this immunity?
Thanks, Justin. To the best of my knowledge, I mean, we've entered into agreements with Pfizer as well as the Serum Institute of India, where we have provided such indemnity. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is up in the air. There's nothing out there as to whether or not they have entered into an agreement of this nature. But if you look at the circumstances under which we procured the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I do suspect that a similar such agreement was entered into. Now, when it comes to any government agreement, the relevant department has to comply with the Public Finance Management Act. And in terms of the PFMA, indemnities generally are precluded unless certain criteria are fulfilled. And in this case, it's necessary for both the Minister of Health as well as the Minister of Finance to authorize the agreement which includes such an indemnity. So it doesn't necessarily follow that any pharmaceutical company will enter into an agreement which contains an indemnity. A number of factors will be taken into account. And these factors include the efficacy of the vaccine, possible risk to government, as well as the nature of the manufacturer itself. They're not going to enter into an agreement with some arbitrary pharmaceutical company who purports to have a vaccine. They will go through the necessary due diligence. The difficulty that we're having, however, with the present instance is that we're in a pandemic and we're not playing on a level playing field. We need the vaccine, and the pharmaceutical companies know it. And I think the Minister of Health summed the position up quite accurately when he said that when it comes to issues of liability, some issues are non-negotiable. Either we accept the terms and conditions, we don't get the vaccine. So, I mean, to sum up, we're between a rock and a hard place. And chances are that wherever the vaccine is procured by the Department of Health and administered to us, will follow that there is an indemnity in favor of that pharmaceutical company.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dion. Let's maybe get an international perspective on this. And globally, can governments contract out of liability in the same way that these pharma companies have been given immunity? And Zaid or Ramiro, I'm not sure if either one of you would like to comment on that.
So I don't know, Ramiro, do you want to go first, and then I'll?
Okay, yeah, let's do that. So this is a very interesting question. So we have seen in the past some scenarios in which actually governments did look up for insurance coverage or reinsurance. So there is one example that comes to mind, and that was in 2010 with the swine flu vaccination. We were made aware of a setup in some Nordic countries. For example, if I recall correctly, it was mainly Sweden and Finland, in which you know, the government, as it is now, the government has taken a key role in coordinating the vaccination. It was rolled out very quickly, very extensively to those population in the highest risk classes, very similar to what we are seeing today. And as this was orchestrated and and regulated by the government, there was likewise there were liability waivers agreed with. In that case, it was GlaxoSmithKline, and some of these schemes, governmental schemes or pools, did look for insurance cover. I don't know the details of it, but I believe there was some kind of private participation in these pools as well. So it was not purely a governmental type of scheme, but it was already some kind of private involvement there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ramiro. And Zaid, I don't know if you have to add on to that.
Yeah, just maybe 2 or 3 points quickly, Justin. So I think Ramiro covered that in a sense, but there's the fact that the government accepts the possibility of there being some issues, right, is by default accepting some form of potential harm. So we don't know the detail of these so-called maybe whole harmless agreements between the manufacturer and the vaccine developer and the governments. But I think that at the end of the day, the government will have to take the responsibility if there is no negligence or anything to do with the manufacturer itself. There will be some recourse to say the government takes the responsibility for these injuries if they have entered into that in a broad sense. However, going forward, I think, as Ramiro mentioned, it most probably will be a pooling arrangement. I don't know to what extent, but I think that will most probably be, if this is the way it's going to be, some form of pooling arrangement to deal with the liabilities of this situation if it comes out in later time. But yeah, at the moment it's still not yet sure. Can you completely absolve yourself from any indemnity? I'm not sure. I think that will play out in the legal scenario.
So maybe if I can add something, and I keep it short. So the US, the way the US is dealing with this, they created a scheme or a compensation program where they have very, very clear rules on what will trigger a compensation following an adverse event. An unexpected adverse event after vaccination. So there is a time frame, and there is really a very clearly defined threshold. And this is a governmental compensation scheme. The government, and the very special thing about it is that the compensation amounts are very small compared to what we would normally see in the pharmaceutical environment in the US. So in a nutshell, the government created a pool or a compensation, a bucket where there is resources allocated, and then anyone that gets, let's say, from a list of adverse events, on a certain period of time after vaccination will receive the fixed amount, a fixed compensation amount. So that's something which is very very well known in the US, and I have more would be interested.
Thank you so much, Ramiro. Let's talk. Let's hear a bit about general liability, and we've got Melita Thurling, who's our head of general liability. I will just say that I'm seeing some great questions on the chat group and the Q&A from Billy and Simon and Wendy. So I'd like to get through these questions, and we'll try and make sure that we have some time to answer some questions. So keep the questions coming, and we will make time to answer them. So Melita, let's talk a little bit about the vaccination sites and around a vaccination site. What are the possible exposures in relation to public liabilities such as slips and trips, and how can a facility mitigate these? If you're there, Melita.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Certainly potential slip and trip claims caused by higher footfall, especially if the facility is one where you have more people traffic than you usually experience. What you can do is do a review and assess any potential risk. Obvious things like uneven floors, steps, fix or highlight these. Don't allow food and drink to be consumed on the premises, because that's often where the problems arise. Have adequate signage pointing out risks, and also set out a clear and obvious indemnity or disclaimer, contracting out, if you possibly can, of any liability for a slip and trip. Obviously, the COVID-19 requirements must be adhered to, manage social distancing and access, as well as availability of sanitizer and so on. Ensure your emergency exits are clear and easily seen. Beef up your cleaning processes and procedures, and more importantly, record them. Make sure there's documentation available to be able to show what those processes are, how often the premises are cleaned and by whom. And then there are other aspects to be concerned about as well, things like adequate security around the venue, so that those at the site are protected as well as their property, and including the vaccines themselves, which we know might become targets. They are valuable commodities. So we need to look at that. And then also manage issues like crowd control. Maybe people are desperate, maybe there's a panic, maybe there's overcrowding. So that sort of thing is really important in terms of looking after your potential liability. And from an I2 perspective, we could potentially look at this as purely a premises risk, but any claim relating to COVID-19 would be excluded in terms of the exclusion that we have. Hope that's helpful.
Perfect. Thank you, Melita. I mean, one of the things that I'm certainly sensing here is for the broker community, there's a lot to think about if you're a broker trying to advise your clients. There are a lot of different aspects of insurance, a lot of different scenarios. So I do hope to all of our brokers that this panel of experts on the red couch is giving you some oversight and ideas of what are the different things that you and your clients should be thinking about. Melita, probably a fairly simple question, but do brokers need to advise or do clients need to advise their brokers if their premises are being used as a vaccination site?
Sure, I think all the brokers can answer this one. But yeah, absolutely, as this materially changes the risk. The broker would need to inform us as underwriters so that this can be noted on the policy and the underwriting impact assessed, and we can look at adding any additional terms and conditions that need to be applied. So for sure.
Thank you very much, Melita. And when in doubt, always best to notify your broker or your insurer. Okay, let's talk a little bit about products liability. I think that's a really interesting part. We've spoken a bit about immunity of certain pharma companies and governments, but maybe Zaid, I mean, could you maybe share some of your views on what has been the international response regarding immunity for the vaccine from a products liability exposure? And surely this must be the single biggest risk around a vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a challenge with pharmaceutical period, right? So it's not an easy part of the chain, or rather of the exposure. Ramiro can also just add maybe afterwards some of his observations, but I think we need to break it down. So you have the product itself, the liability of the product itself, that it causes some injury in that respect, being from a toxicity level or whatever the case might be. And then you have the inefficacy side, right, which is more the product doesn't do what it was intended to do, and you might have a problem there. So there are two, I would say, in a way, if you want to call it, they're both products, but they're distinct in certain features. And one relates to bodily injury or to some injury to the individual or individuals, and the other relates to the fact that this did not actually do what it said it was going to do, the inefficacy part. There's also the issue around if the manufacturer or anything warrants anything on the product, and the potential also for recall if something goes wrong with the batch. Remember, when we talk of products liability, we're talking of batches of product. They don't all get manufactured in the same at one go and off you go, right? They come in different batches in different time frames. There might be different manufacturing facilities around. You may not have it all from one manufacturing site. It might be geographically distributed, coming in from different areas. And all those things have to be taken into account. Products liability on pharmaceutical generally is a big challenge. We know that, and I think Ramiro can touch on that as well. What is currently happening is, I think, most probably, I mean, this is part of the larger pharmaceutical programs that they have as well, the large companies that we know of in the world. This is part of their job, so that will be, they don't have to notify with developing a vaccine or anything of that sort. That's part of their mandate or the DNA. But I think in SA, and maybe Dion can also speak about this, we have the Consumer Protection Act, right? And the Consumer Protection Act just about brings everybody in connection with that product possibly into a potential lawsuit, and then gets filtered out to see where the actual negligence lies. So I think these are the things that one has to look at. So if it goes, as Ramiro mentioned at the start, if it goes from the whole chain of things, all those parties involved may at some point in time, if there is alteration or storage problems or issues around labeling or messaging or not getting on time to the point where it should be getting, these are all part of the potential product liability loss. And I think it's not an easy one to deal with. I think each one will have to be looked at separately. But in the overall scheme of things, I think product liability and pharmaceutical generally is always challenging. I don't know if you want to add on that.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on everything. So perhaps just to make it clear, at least from our point of view, or we are we have a very cautious, or let's say we don't have really we don't think that we lack of efficacy. So if the vaccine is not doing what it's supposed to do, we do not think that that's something that should necessarily be insurable. That's a kind of a business risk where one actually, for a number of reasons, this is you will come across very strong statements about this, that this is beyond what is insurable. We do get from time to time requests on this, but we have a very solid response. From some regions do tend to try again and again to get something like that, but at least from our point of view, my understanding is that we have a very clear one on that. And then the other point I wanted to make to Zaid's comment is that an adverse event, bodily injury, could arise not only from a hazardous product itself, so that the product is intrinsically causing an injury, but it could also be because it was either administered the wrong way, there was an issue during the administration, or even during the transportation and storage. So from an exposure point of view, it would be very important to understand whether this is something we can really measure or limit. So in other words, is there a way we can know if the vaccine, let's say we're talking about Johnson & Johnson, is 2 to 8 degrees storage conditions or refrigerated normal fridge, is there a way we can track these temperatures to rule out that this was something from the distribution partner, that the distribution partner made a mistake? And then we have seen there were in the US and in other places there were a number of vaccines which could not be used because of not observing the cold chain, and they had to be thrown away. So this is something that happens, and it happens normally also with other vaccines. So, but in this case, since the exposure will be so massive and in such a short period of time, it would be very important to have a way to try to, to triage the source of the error that ultimately could have led to a bodily injury or to a reaction to the vaccine.
Thank you so much, Ramiro. I mean, Zaid, we've got 2 questions on the group that maybe you could just give a very quick view on them.
Right.
Wendy, one of our brokers, has asked us, so what about businesses that have supported the Solidarity Fund? And that was really the charitable fund that was set up that businesses could support. And a large portion of that money went into procuring vaccines. Is there any way, as part of the value chain, those businesses could be held liable?
Yeah, so if I understand it correctly, that businesses in some way financially supported this and sort of contributed, if I can use that word. Is that what
Yes,
I'm
that's correct.
understanding?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's a voluntary act. I'm not sure how far that can be taken into account in the actual situation of a claim. I think that goes towards the issue about for the common good and helping out and seeing whatever in this unusual situation, whoever can assist will assist. But I'm not sure how far this will go out in the legal liability point of view, whether it will be taken into account or not, whether they could be brought into a lawsuit because of their funding or whatever the case might be. That's a bit of a difficult one. I think here this is more charitable and a benevolent act, right? In the sense of trying to get something developed.
I agree with you, Zaid. I mean, I think the point of this is it's a panel discussion, so we don't have clear answers on everything. It's good to have the debate, and in the debate there's learning. But I think your answer is reasonably clear that it's probably unlikely that businesses that have contributed to the Solidarity Fund would be pulled into the chain. Let's bring this back to a bit of a local flavor on products liability, Melita. So Melita, can you just give an overview of our response and some of your thoughts on products liability?
Sure. I think Zaid's already touched on some of it. We do not underwrite the manufacture of pharma, including vaccines, for many valid reasons, as you've already heard. And amongst them from our side certainly is, we don't have the intricate knowledge that's required. There's a potential for exponential claims. Treaty exclusions are in place. Our risk appetite in this regard, and the fact that these are normally written in specialist global programs. So, it wouldn't fall within what we would do. Product liability, as we've already heard, is and especially for vaccines and pharma, is controversial and difficult. So some vaccines have inherent harmful side effects that can't be avoided, even if they're properly made and manufactured. It's just like part of the parcel. You get the vaccine, there's a potential to have these side effects, and that's just part of the deal. There isn't anything actually wrong with the vaccine, that's just how it works. So, that's an issue. Often there are laws governing liability. As we've heard, the US has specific laws around this sort of thing. Often there's contracting out of liability, and we've also touched on that. Or liability hold harmless type agreements are entered into between the manufacturer and governments. I don't know if you guys saw, there was a news report last night where the World Health Organization is setting up a no-fault compensation fund for the vaccines for harmful side effects that may or may not arise. Well, that may arise, obviously you wouldn't get compensation for something that didn't, but they're setting up this fund for the COVAX program, the vaccines that are distributed through the COVAX program. So that's quite an interesting new initiative that we're seeing here in South Africa. It won't cover, I assume, the vaccines that are distributed outside of COVAX, but it's quite an interesting thing to have a look at. So yeah, it's a complex underwriting that needs to happen. As I say, we don't do it. And apart from our underwriting stance, we have our COVID-19 exclusion, which I will mention several times today, which will apply, effectively taking away any cover under this sort of liability section. Thanks, Joe.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Melita. We are running short of time, but this is good conversation. So let's do our best to get all of the questions in and answer the questions that are on the group. And where we don't get the answers or don't get to them, we'll make sure that we respond and get to all of the answers. I'm also happy that we go a little bit over time for those of you that want to stay, because I think this is such a great conversation. And this is the point of getting a panel of experts onto the red couch. So let's go back to Dion with a bit of a legal view, and maybe you want to just give us a brief overview of the laws regulating vaccines in South Africa.
Thanks, Justin. I mean, the primary source of legislation is the Medicines and Related Substances Act, and that governs all medication, all clinical trials, and all medical devices. And the Act establishes the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, SAPRA, and they're essentially the regulatory body which is responsible for regulating medicines and the like. Now, what's interesting is, just to complicate the lives of us lawyers, SAPRA is a juristic person, a separate juristic person to the Department of Health. So in the event of liability arising and it points towards a failure on the regulatory body to ensure the safety and quality of the vaccine that is being administered, that's another entity that needs to be considered. Ultimately, they report to the Minister of Health, and he would still be the responsible party in the litigation. But as pointed out by Zaid earlier, overarching, what we can't ignore is the Consumer Protection Act, and that places everybody in the supply chain to the direct line of fire when it comes to the administration of the vaccine. And even though the different parties in the supply chain may contract between themselves to include indemnities, at the end of the day, those indemnities are only good as between those contracting parties. So the patient hasn't indemnified anybody in the supply chain. In terms of the CPA, the patient can hold anybody liable. So it's everybody from the discount pharmacy where you receive the vaccine, right up to the pharmaceutical company, including the Department of Health, including SAPRA. And then it's up to those parties to rely on the provisos in the Consumer Protection Act to say, listen, it wasn't me because I had nothing to do with the cause of your problem. So from that perspective, the indemnities don't really help much, especially insofar as the defense costs are, because with all the indemnities coupled with the Consumer Protection Act, it just makes life as a lawyer very interesting in this space.
Perfect. Deon, while you're on the red couch and answering that, we have one question from Willie Janssen van Rensburg, I2's claims expert, which I think is interesting from a legal perspective. So he says, if the government contracted out of liability with suppliers of the vaccine, what recourse does an individual have against the state if the vaccine causes injuries, for example? Do you have any brief views on that?
So, let me understand the question. If the government contracts out of liability with suppliers, what recourse do the patients have against the government? That indemnity only operates between the state and those suppliers. You cannot have an indemnity operate against a third party. So there's no agreement binding, for instance. So the situation is government contracts with, let me use this scheme again, contracts with this scheme. I go for the vaccine at this scheme, and something happens to me. I hold government liable. They cannot rely on that indemnity insofar as it relates to me. What they have to do, they then have to join this scheme and say, listen to this scheme, you administered this vaccine. In terms of my agreement with you, you have indemnified me against loss. Therefore, you, this scheme, are liable to compensate Deon. But at the end of the day, where the money comes from, insofar as my cause of action is, it comes from the government, it comes from the state, and then it's left for the state to recover that compensation that was payable to me from this scheme.
Thank you so much, Deon.
I think just one more point there. I think it's really, maybe Deon has a view about, just personally, I cannot see you indemnifying a person's rights to claim away, right? It's just not possible. each one of us have a right to remedy. So you can't indemnify completely unless you do it by legislation, which takes a long time and it's debated. So I think in this situation, that would be very difficult to say that, you as an injured party cannot sue. It's a basic right.
That's spot on. But if we take Billy's question a step further, if this scheme contracts with me as the patient, and in that contract, there's an indemnity clause, I don't have a choice. If I want to receive the vaccine, I have to agree to sign that contract. And it's usually written in like font 4 at the back of the informed consent that you sign. That indemnity is unlikely to be upheld because it's contrary to public policy. And then the string of cases which speaks to parties contracting on equal and fair grounds. So where the parties are on equal footing, more or less, if you talk about the suppliers in the supply chain, then those indemnities may be enforceable. But when you're contracting with a man on the street, completely different story. So those principles of public policy, fairness, equality, take into account the uneven bargaining power of the consumer. And in those circumstances, those indemnities will not be upheld.
Thank you so much, Dion. So in the interest of time, because we've got a couple of minutes left, I want to cover maybe some areas of directors and officers liability. So I'm going to ask Tove just to skip to Jonathan Healy's first question, or JH's first question. And Jono, it would be good to just get some of your perspectives on where are the potential employment practices liability and directors and officers liability risks around a vaccine. And those questions that we've skipped, we will make sure that we send some responses to those. So John, I think the question is, can an employer mandate or sponsored vaccinations? Can it result in employment practice liability exposure for businesses? And maybe a brief comment on, can employers, even employers of healthcare workers, force a vaccine on anyone?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I think to Zaid's point at the beginning of the presentation, these casualty type risks, DNO and EPL are still in the early days of kind of what we're going to see potentially rolling out from a claims perspective. I mean, but to answer that specific question, I mean, nobody can force a recipient to take a vaccine. And so that was noted, in the president's speech when we kind of launched the first rollout, was that nobody's going to be forced to take it. And in terms of our legislative framework, we don't have a mandatory vaccine schedule in the country for any level of vaccine. So employers will not be able to mandate vaccines in their employee environment. And it can potentially lead to some kind of employment practices liability claims, because whilst an employer can't mandate the vaccine on employees, what you might start to find is sort of the elements around that in terms of potential discrimination. Say for example, you've got an employee whose part of their role is they need to travel, and you get to a stage where vaccine passports are required. And as part of your role, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've had a vaccination and can fulfill the terms of your contract. In those instances, what will happen? The allegations from an employee side would be that there's some level of unfair dismissal, or perhaps even invasion of privacy, or discrimination based on belief or health status. So I think it's still yet to be seen, but yes, potentially as these issues roll out, we could see that this vaccine rollout can end up with some EPL claims.
Jono, another question for you while you're on the red couch. You've been far too quiet on our panel. And here's an interesting one, because I think we're at a time when we have passed our second spike of the virus. We know that if you listen to last session with Graham Codrington, that a third spike may come, but it's a relatively safe time. And we certainly are seeing many businesses coming back to the office in a limited and controlled fashion. And this probably applies to all businesses, Jono, but can directors of a business be held liable for not providing, a safe environment for the employees returning to work? And this is your general day-to-day business. I think that's a really interesting question that brokers should be talking to all of their clients about.
Yeah, and I think directors and officers can be held responsible. I mean, whether or not it's something that's going to be an easy to prove scenario is another question. So you have employees who are going to have been doing their shopping at Pick and Pay and Woolies and visiting friends and family. So there's nothing to demonstrate that they would have contracted COVID at the office. So it's going to be a very difficult thing to prove. But as discussed previously, there's nothing that prevents somebody from holding a director or officer responsible for some kind of alleged wrongfulness that they believe has resulted in injury. In terms of the directors and officers framework and policy response, we don't cover any bodily injury or sickness there, but there's an element of defense costs which may kick in that event. But I think more so than somebody actually falling ill at the office and having some kind of adverse response due to not having the available PPE. I think from a directors and officers perspective, the fallout is going to be more around the concerns resulting from COVID. So failure to manage, failure to exercise oversight for continuity of business for where people are working remote or when they're coming back to the office but not managing comorbidities, etc. So I think the risk on DNO is more around the management of the environment, less so than actually having people back in the office. But then it's still the responsibility of the senior leadership and directors to make sure that they have complied with the necessary requirements for health and safety in the work environment. And so to answer the question, yes, they can be held responsible for failure to do so, but it would be a difficult case to prove.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jono. So I know that we've kind of run out of time. So what I'm going to suggest is that we take just a few more minutes and we get one or two more wrap-up questions for each of the panels. So we'll keep it to 2 or 3 more questions. If you do have to leave us because we're over time and you need to go and find business to place with R2, we will forgive you. But what I would like to say on a serious note is that I think this has been a really great conversation with lots of questions, and we will publish all of the questions and some bullet points around the answers so that at least our brokers have some guidance as to what are some of the things that you need to think about in advising your clients. So maybe a few very short questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists to keep to the point on this so we can wrap up. But Fia, maybe 2 questions for you that you can answer in one. Can a patient sue a doctor for contracting COVID if it was a non-related COVID visit? And maybe Fia, there's been a lot on ivermectin in the press at the moment. And what is the liability attaching to doctors or vets if they use ivermectin? So there's a lot to answer in one short question, but give it a shot as best you can, Fia.
I'll try my best to be short and brief. Just to chat about the contracting of COVID. If it's not related to the treatment of a patient, our policy response would not give cover to that. But I think what's important to have in consideration is that each practitioner should employ in his process a proper protocol of screening his patients and isolation. But there's nothing stopping a patient from suing his doctor for potential COVID related circumstances. But again, like Jonathan said, it's very difficult to prove because you could have been in Woolies before you got to the doctor's offices and then somehow got the virus there. So it could be done, but again, very difficult to prove. In respect of ivermectin, we all know that this is a drug that is meant for animal use and there is human consumption. The SAPRA has not given the go-ahead for the drug to be used. However, they have used it and have recommended for extreme circumstances where somebody has almost literally about to pass away, it may be used. Until such time as it being approved, our policy would not respond to any ivermectin related type claims. Thanks, Justin.
Perfect. So there you have it. If you take ivermectin, many studies show it is effective, but if not yet approved, and you probably won't have insurance cover. So I'm going to ask one more question to Dion and one more question to our experts from Swiss Re. So Dion, I think a really interesting question for you to end up is, why can't people have a choice of vaccine? We've heard The different vaccines have different effectiveness and slightly different terms of use. Why can't people choose which vaccine they want, and do they have a right to choose and specify which vaccine they want?
I suppose at the end of the day, you do have a choice if you're willing to wait for things to normalize. But as with anything that we've discussed today, we're working within certain parameters. So your luxury of choice is limited given the availability of the current vaccine. If you do want to end up in a situation where you want to choose your vaccine, I mean, look at what Melita has said regarding the vaccine which is going to be distributed in terms of COVAX. I would much rather go for that when I know that there's a fixed line of compensation if something goes wrong, as opposed to something where there's a whole lot of uncertainty. The problem is that if you exercise that choice, it might be to your detriment. You need the vaccine now, unfortunately, the choices are limited. So it's essentially up to you. But yes, you do have a choice, but not right now. From a legal perspective, you need to be able to hold the government liable from an efficacy perspective. Something with a higher efficacy level arises a year down the line. So from that perspective, unfortunately, we make do with what we have.
Perfect. And then to end off, I'm going to ask one final question to Swiss Re. And then just to emphasize again, it's been a really great discussion, lots of good topics. We will circulate some written answers to the questions and the ones we didn't get to. And it's been great having you with us for this debate. We do still have a number of participants on. So last question for Swiss Re, and I think this is a really interesting one. Maybe Zaid, you want to kick this off? But why can't we as private individuals source our own vaccines? We've had lots of debate in South Africa about discovery or companies or individuals going directly to the pharma companies and sourcing their own vaccines. We've had complaints at government, but we heard last week from Grant Corrington that actually our government is doing a reasonable job, and given our size and wealth as a country, we're doing reasonably well. But I think, Zaid, the question is, why can't we as individuals or private companies go and source the vaccine right now?
Yeah, I think Ramiro can also jump in here, and I think maybe he wants to just add one or two things about the Johnson & Johnson topic, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Because that's the path SA has initiated on, right, initially. I think individual vaccines at this point in time, Dion alluded to it, I think you just, it would not make sense if you're trying to get some form of uniformity in an unusual situation and some form of consistency. I think once that is sorted, and when there is sort of X percentage of the population that's vaccinated and everybody is comfortable, then it would become most probably going forward like you and I going once a year to decide whether we want to or whether we don't want to, and you have a choice. I think at this point in time, it just would not make sense to do that. It doesn't stop anybody from doing it. I mean, I'm sure there are people trying to. I'm not saying there aren't, but I think it needs to be very, very clinical in a sense, and I use that word in a different context, in the sense of administering, distributing and so forth, to make sure that there is a foundation that has been set, and thereafter, most probably, it would most probably be left to the individuals. But yeah, that it's very difficult to now say, look, it's all about, I can afford it and do it. Fine, maybe you could. But I think, there is a broader spectrum here that one has to look at. Ramiro, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah. So basically, I think the bottom line here is that vaccines are a scarce resource, right? Scarce. We don't have as many as we would like to have. So with that in mind, you really need to have, a public-wide, a population-wide view on how to tackle this problem, right? So with that in mind, it makes sense that the first vaccines available will go to put those populations at risk, safer. So meaning older people, which are more prone to develop a severe disease, and those that have concomitant diseases or comorbidities, which also put them as an increased risk for severe disease. Following on that, certainly you have the healthcare providers, which are per se are highly exposed to being infected. But as I said, I think going forward, and we are already getting some evidence that the vaccines are very good at controlling the dissemination, for once the severity of the disease, and it's still less clear, but it seems that it's going to be also the dissemination of the disease might somehow be controlled by the vaccines. We do have some evidence of that. So then in some countries where they have really vaccinated already very, very high percentage of their populations. So going forward, and once these vaccines, have reached a plateau of production, that's also something that should not be forgotten. It's likely that one could potentially, access to the vaccine as an individual, right, and go to to a pharmacy or to a vaccination center and ask to get vaccinated, and potentially even one might be able to choose with which one. So these are likely scenarios, but now we are still, let's say, in war mode, where we really want, or we should be, the government should be aiming and is aiming at saving lives, right, of those which are at high risk. So it makes fully sense to go for those populations.
Thank you so much, Zaid and Ramiro. So I think that's an interesting question, maybe not a legal or insurance issue, but a moral one, and looking after our communities and our country, I guess the world, giving the vaccine to the people that need it first most. So I think that's a good time to end off. And I would like to say a big thank you to all of our brokers and our tours that have listened to this call. I think it's been a very informative discussion. And of course, a big thank you to Dion Francis from Clyde & Co., Zaid and Ramiro, our reinsurance partners and experts from Swiss Re, and our team of experts. We say at our tour, we want to be famous for being experts, and certainly I'm very proud of Jono and Melita and Fia for contributing to this panel of experts and holding up and sharing some of our views. So thank you very much. Look out for our next Tuesday on the Red Couch. We'll be doing more of these panel discussions, and we will come back to you with some written responses to some of the questions that we didn't get to. So thank you very much for joining. And as is customary, brokers, we'd love to hear you shout out as you're leaving and saying cheers.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Zaid, Dion, Ramiro.
Bye, guys.
Cheers, everyone. Have a good day and go and get the vaccine when you can.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers, everyone.
Tove, show us your face and say hello to all of the R2 brokers.
Cheers all. Thanks for an interesting one.
Thank you, everybody.
Tove, thank you for putting this together. I think it's really appropriate that we say thanks to Tove, who is looking at us now on her screen. Tove has coordinated this panel of experts from around the world, put together the questions, and Tove is the lady that has been bringing you our Tuesdays and Fridays since March last year. So Tove, a big well done to you for, I think, a really great session.
And thank you to everybody for attending. See you all next week.
Perfect.
Bye, guys.
Okay. Cheers, everyone. See you next week, Tuesday. Same time, same place.